The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. Almighty and everlasting God, you are always more ready to hear than we to pray, and to give more than we either desire or deserve. Pour upon us the abundance of your mercy, forgiving us those things of which our conscience is afraid, and giving us those good things for which we are not worthy to ask, except through the merits and mediation of Jesus Christ our Saviour, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, for ever and ever. Amen. Would you be seated? I'm Andrew McGowan, the Dean of Berkeley Divinity School, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here for this academic convocation with the conferral of honorary degrees and the Cheney lecture for 2024. We have with us a number of distinguished guests and visitors for that purpose and for others, and you're all very welcome. Today is also a day of celebration for the school as we prepare to celebrate the renovation and renewal of the Berkeley Center. And we hope that after the event today, you may come and join us again in the afternoon here in the chapel, first for a panel discussion with our honorees, and then at 6 p.m. for our regular community Eucharist, which will be celebrated in this place as it is with our student body every week of the term. And then afterwards to join us at the Berkeley Center, where we will engage in that celebratory act of rededication and have dinner, as we are wont to do on Wednesday evenings. So this is a day of extended celebrations for us. We hope that you have the stamina, and please pray that I have the stamina for the whole thing as well. It is a great pleasure for us to acknowledge in our presence a number of distinguished persons upon whom the trustees of the Berkeley Divinity School have seen fit to bestow honorary degrees. In a moment, I will ask the chair of the board to come forward and join me, and for the assistant secretary to the board, the Reverend Dr. Clayton Thomason, who will come and read the citations for each of the four honorees in turn. As their names are initially called, I'm going to invite each of them to stand just by themselves. It's that sort of embarrassing moment, I think, isn't it? We have to put up with those things. And to stand either in body or in spirit, as may be appropriate, and for the secretary to read the citation, after which Mr. Elrod, the chair of the board, will confer the degree formally with a diploma, and we will place the hoods around their neck. And I think in this instance, because there are 4 of them and not 34, you should feel free to applaud after each one, rather than holding your applause to the end. So I now invite Mr. Elrod and Dr. Thomason to come forward for the conferral of honorary degrees.
Becca Stevens. Becca Stevens, you are a priest, an author, a social entrepreneur known to and admired by many as founder of Thistle Farms in Nashville. While you are now a proud Tennessean, we welcome you to the state in which you were born and to the seminary from which your own father graduated. After his untimely death at the hands of a drunk driver when you were just 5 years old, through your mother's struggle, you came to understand, you have said, in the many ways, large and small and sometimes life-changing, that love can be shown by attending to the practical needs of others. You yourself studied at the University of the South and at Vanderbilt Divinity School, where you were ordained in 1991 and served as the Church of the Resurrection in Franklin, Tennessee, and then since 1995 at St. Augustine's Chapel at Vanderbilt. Originally established as Magdalene in 1997, you've led Thistle Farms in its work to heal, empower, and employ female survivors of human trafficking, prostitution, and addiction. You have spoken openly about your own experience of abuse in a church setting and offered support to those women who, as you have termed it, break up dysfunctional communities with the plowshare of truth. The mantra of Thistle Farms is love heals, and your work with your partners and supporters has been a transformative proof of this simple claim for many. From a single home for 5 women, Thistle Farms has grown to include job training, health care, case management, and employment. Today it comprises 6 residences in Nashville and a national network of organizations that provide similar services in sanctuaries across the country. You're the author of at least 12 books, some collaborations with the women of Thistle Farms, combining pastoral care, spirituality, and scriptural reflection that draw on your experience and that of women with whom you have worked to offer a wider readership your insights into love and life and ministry. Much of your ethos can perhaps be summed up in your words: all of us learn more from mercy than from judgment. You've been recognized as the 2000 Nashvilleian of the Year, and in 2013 you were inducted into the Tennessee Women's Hall of Fame. You were also named a 2016 CNN Hero, a 2014 Humanitarian of the Year by the Small Business Council of America, and a 2011 Champion of Change by the Obama White House. The Dean and trustees of Berkeley Divinity School at Yale take pleasure in adding to your many well-deserved honors by conferring on you the degree of Doctor of Divinity honoris causa. Dr. Catherine Meeks, you credit your mother with teaching you to love God and to love yourself as a child of God. You also credit your mother for having taught you the importance of education, resilience, compassion. Your life's work has manifested these lessons in abundance. Your first taste of activism was leading demonstrations while an undergraduate at Pepperdine University. After graduating there in 1970 with a bachelor's degree in speech education, you earned a master's degree in social work from Clark Atlanta University and a PhD from Emory University. You went on to a 25-year career at Mercer University, including as Assistant Dean of Women, instructor, and assistant professor, before the mayor of Macon, Georgia, asked you to lead a youth violence prevention task force for just 2 years. After this, you were recruited to Wesleyan College, where you became Clara Carter Ackrey Distinguished Professor of Sociocultural Studies and the founding executive director of the Lane Center for Community Engagement and Service. There, as well as being the director of Aunt Maggie's Kitchen Table, a family resource center located in a public housing facility. Activism and scholarship have always been your passions and companions. You've been a visiting distinguished scholar at Pepperdine, visiting lecturer at Candler School of Theology at Emory, a frequent national workshop leader and a lay preacher in the Episcopal Church. You were the organizer of Standing on Their Shoulders, a celebration of the wisdom of African American women, a 9-year project which identified and honored 100 African American women and led to a book highlighting their lives. You were the founding member of the Center for Racial Understanding and have organized citywide marches against violence, major community wellness fairs, and food and clothing drives. You may be best known to Episcopalians as founding executive director of the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing, from where your voice and leadership have resounded in the national sphere. You've received the NAACP Earl Scheinholster Freedom Fund Award, the W.E.B. Du Bois Award for Distinguished Community Service, and been named the Georgia Sociologist of the Year. You were named a 2022 Presidential Award Lifetime Achievement honoree by President Biden and awarded the Presidential Volunteer Service Award Medal. You are the author, among others, of Living into God's Dream, Dismantling Racism in America, The Night is Long but Light Comes in the Morning, and Passion for Justice, Ida B. Wells as a Prophet for Our Time. Berkeley and Yale alumnus Michael Curry has said of you that you embody what Dr. King in a sermon saw in Jesus of Nazareth, a tough mind and a tender heart. With thanks for the work of this mind and heart, the Dean and trustees of Berkeley Divinity School at Yale confer upon you the degree of Doctor of Divinity, honoris causa. Sam Sifton, you are known to many readers and cooks as a muse or co-creator of excellent meals from your work as founding editor of the New York Times Cooking, and regular appearance in many inboxes as a bearer of help when the idea of what to cook this week seems too much to bear, including the now famous, my favorite, No Recipe recipes, which have their own cookbooks with you as their author. Quite a few of these grateful cooks and eaters may have been surprised, though, if they were led by your 2020 book, See You on Sunday, and opened it to read the opening words. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, which most of us would recognize as part of the description of the early life of the Christian community in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 2. This level of biblical literacy and the frankness with which it's presented may be less surprising when we learn that you are the grandson of Yale Divinity School alumnus Reinhold Niebuhr. That could be the lecture hall that we meet in here, right? And Ursula Niebuhr, founder of Barnard College's religion department, and hence also, lest we forget, also the great-nephew of Yale's own esteemed faculty member, H. Richard Niebuhr. You were educated at Harvard and began a career that has included teaching in New York public schools, journalism at American Heritage, the New York Press, where you anticipated your multiple roles at the Times by being variously restaurant critic and managing editor, and Talk, and of course the New York Times, where you have been restaurant critic, editor of the cooking pages, culture editor, and even national editor. The opening chapter of that book, entitled A Theory of Dinner, is worth the read even for those more inclined to open a can than a cookbook, and references to the miracle at Cana, the nature of the Eucharist, as well as the perhaps less spectacular but equally profound contributions you have made to meals shared in and by your Episcopal parish in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. In practice, as on the pages of the Times, and in your books, you show readers, guests, and fellow cooks that the significance of food in a world hungry both for food itself, but also for community and compassion, is not merely dietary or culinary, but social, and hence also, we would add in this company, necessarily theological. As one of your children says, church ought to be just like dinner. But dinner is often church, too. With thanks for your ministry at many tables, your pursuit of truth and insight in journalism, and your advocacy of hospitality, sustainability, and sociability, the Dean and trustees of the Berkeley Divinity School at Yale take pleasure in awarding you the degree Doctor of Humane Letters, honoris causa. Sean Rowe, born in Sharon, Pennsylvania, you grew up in Western Pennsylvania and came to know and to love that culture, as you have stated in a 2019 interview. You came from a family of primarily steel and mill workers in a region that was becoming what we now call the Rust Belt. You graduated from Grove City College in 1997 with a BA in history, and from Virginia Theological Seminary in 2000, and later took a PhD in organizational learning and leadership at Gannon University in Erie in 2014. You had returned to Western Pennsylvania from seminary to be the rector of St. John's Episcopal Church in Franklin, Pennsylvania, when in May 2007, at the age of 32, you were elected bishop of Northwestern Pennsylvania on the first ballot. For almost 12 years, you were the youngest bishop in the Episcopal Church. You also served as Bishop Provisional of the Diocese of Bethlehem from 2014 until 2018, and became Bishop Provisional of Western New York in 2019. By your own account, you had seen that Western New York shares a culture with the Diocese of Northwestern Pennsylvania, and you were heartened to learn that the Right Reverend William Franklin, formerly Berkeley's dean and bishop of Western New York, was open to exploring the current partnership, which has seen you act as bishop for the two neighboring dioceses. Those hitherto unusual combinations of diocesan roles have been widely seen as forms of leadership foreshadowing, reorganizing diocesan boundaries, but also a willingness to rethink how Episcopal leadership can best work to serve and lead the very local worshiping communities of the Episcopal Church. Your roles of leadership in the wider structures of the Episcopal Church have been numerous, even prior to your call. As a parliamentarian for the House of Bishops and the Executive Council, as chair of the Episcopal Church Building Fund, and as a member of the Standing Commission on Structure, Governance, and Constitution and Canons. You were elected 28th presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church at the 81st General Convention in Louisville in June 2024 on the first ballot. Despite 17 years in the episcopate already, when you take up your office, you will be the youngest person ever to have been presiding bishop. In your video presentation as a candidate for presiding bishop, you spoke to our need, quote, to fully embrace the knowledge that people we don't yet recognize, those on the margin, and sometimes those in the center, will meet on the road to tell us Christ is risen. We await with hope our time on the road with you in these years ahead. So the dean and trustees of the Berkeley Divinity School at Yale are pleased to confer on you the degree of Doctor of Divinity, honoris causa.
We'll stand to sing our hymn. Would you be seated? It gives me great pleasure to introduce the Reverend Canon William Lamb as the Cheney Lecturer for 2024. Francis Xavier Cheney was Professor of Pastoral Theology at Berkeley Divinity School, and this lectureship was given in his honour. Will Lamb is the Vicar of the University Church of St Mary in Oxford, and thus, perhaps particularly relevant to note today, the successor of John Henry Newman in that particular role, as well as many other distinguished people. Indeed, the people who preached in that church would take us too long to enunciate to have time left for the lecture. But the place where Cranmer was tried, where Wesley's preached, and so on, is a place of great significance in the history of Anglicanism. After he read theology at Balliol College, Oxford, Will trained for the ministry at Westcott House in Cambridge. He was ordained in 1995, served a curacy at Halifax Minster, and then was a parish priest in South Yorkshire while working also as a tutor at the College of the Resurrection in Murfield. He became Anglican chaplain at the University of Sheffield and was canon residentiary at Sheffield, where he also undertook doctoral studies. In 2010, he became the vice principal of Westcott House, Cambridge, and it was in that role that Berkeley and Will became friends, as it were, in that Westcott House is, of course, the site of a regular exchange program that we have between Yale Divinity School and Westcott House. He has been the Vicar of the University Church since 2017. He's a member of the Faculty of Theology and Religion at Oxford. His own doctoral studies and research have been in the study of the New Testament and its early reception, and not least in Byzantine commentary upon biblical studies. He's also a supernumerary fellow of Harris Manchester College and has been the chair of the trustees of the St. Augustine's Foundation, which is responsible for funding and fostering theological education in the Anglican Communion. Today, his lecture is on the topic of conscience and character. Would you please join me in welcoming the Reverend Canon, Dr. William Lamb.
It's a great delight and pleasure to be here today and to bring greetings from the University Church in Oxford, and also to be able to offer a word of congratulations to our honorary graduates today. This lecture begins and ends with a provocation. The first provocation dates from 1874, when the British Prime Minister William Gladstone, a noted high churchman within the Church of England, published a pamphlet entitled "The Vatican Decrees in Their Bearing on Civil Allegiance, a Political Expostulation." In 1873, Gladstone's government had introduced a bill in Parliament for the extension of university education in Ireland. The purpose was to expand the University of Dublin so that it might become a secular national university incorporating multiple colleges. At the time, Trinity College Dublin was an Anglican foundation, and although admission had been granted to non-Anglican students, the faculty was still required to be Anglican. A small Catholic university had been established in 1851, but it lacked any government recognition, and more to the point, any government funding. Although Gladstone thought he was furthering the cause of Catholic emancipation, the proposal was strongly opposed by the Roman Catholic hierarchy in Ireland. The bill was defeated and Gladstone resigned, although Disraeli, the leader of the opposition, refused to form a government, and so Gladstone soldiered on. When Gladstone's government eventually fell the following year, he retreated to his country estate. He was rather cross. He poured out his frustration in this tract, attributing his fall to the intransigence of the Irish bishops and their acquiescence to the dogma of papal infallibility, which had been promulgated at the First Vatican Council just a few years before in 1870. Gladstone's tract was provocative. He clearly blamed the Roman Catholic hierarchy for his defeat. He asserted that Rome requires a convert to forfeit his moral and mental freedom and to place his loyalty and civil duty at the mercy of another. Gladstone presented the following challenge. England is entitled to ask and to know in what way the obedience required by the Pope and the Council of the Vatican is to be reconciled with the integrity of civil allegiance. Of course, many members of the Roman Catholic hierarchy took offence at Gladstone's tract. A few months later, Henry Manning, the Archbishop of Westminster, responded, repudiating the claims that Gladstone had made and taking issue with the aggressions of the civil power. Henry Manning was a former Anglican clergyman. He had reason to take offence at Gladstone's provocation. He was a convert. But there was another celebrated convert who also chose to respond to Gladstone, John Henry Newman. The bare outline of Newman's life is well rehearsed. Born in 1801, Newman was baptized as a member of the Church of England. He went up to Oxford in 1817 and was elected to a fellowship at Oriel College in 1822. In 1824, 200 years ago, he was ordained as a deacon by the Bishop of Oxford, serving his title as the curate of St. Clement's Church. He was ordained priest the following year. He became the vicar of the University Church of St. Mary the Virgin in 1828 and served in that capacity until 1843. During his tenure, Newman became one of the leaders of the Oxford movement. Along with John Keble, Edward Pusey, and others, he sought to animate the Catholic revival of the Church of England. It's probably fair to say that Newman not only enjoyed controversy, he positively revelled in it. But as time continued, as he lost friends and became increasingly isolated, condemned by university authorities and members of the Anglican hierarchy, including his own bishop, he tired of controversy. He resigned as Vicar of St. Mary's in 1843 and withdrew to the village of Littlemore, where he had established a quasi-religious community. On the 9th of October, 1845, he was received into the Roman Catholic Church. And it's perhaps for this reason that Roman Catholics celebrate his feast day today. In the Church of England's calendar, Newman is commemorated on the 11th of August, the date of his death. And while some Anglicans may balk at choosing this day as his feast day, one can observe that on this day at least, Newman was both an Anglican and a Catholic. Following his reception into the Roman Catholic Church, Newman went to Rome, where he received further training before being ordained as a Roman Catholic priest in 1847. He returned to England and founded an English oratory in Birmingham. He was created a cardinal by Pope Leo XIII in 1879, and he died on the 11th of August in 1890. Beatified in 2010, he was canonized by Pope Francis in 2019. So I sometimes say to people in Oxford, if ever you encounter imposter syndrome, there's nothing quite like having a saint as your predecessor. Currently, the Vatican is considering a petition to have him declared as a doctor of the Church. And in this lecture, I propose to highlight two aspects of his thought. The first relates to conscience and draws on the theological contributions of Anglican as well as Catholic thinkers. The second relates to character and highlights his thinking as an educationalist, particularly in the field of higher education. Both conscience and character throw into sharp relief some of the issues we grapple with in the field of theological education and the spiritual formation of seminarians. Now, like Manning, Newman responded to Gladstone's provocation, and he did so in a rather lengthy letter addressed to the Duke of Norfolk, a prominent Roman Catholic. Not quite sure what the Duke of Norfolk would have made of this long letter, but anyway, as a prominent Roman Catholic, Gladstone wrote to him. Newman's response to Gladstone was significant for a number of reasons. First, Newman had form. He had already entered into a very public row in 1864 with Charles Kingsley, an Anglican clergyman who had been the Regius Professor of Modern History in Cambridge. In a book review, Kingsley had said, "The truth for its own sake had never been a virtue with the Roman clergy. Father Newman informs us that it need not, and on the whole ought not to be." Newman's integrity was being impugned, and this provoked the publication of his Apologia Pro Vita Sua. Newman defended his honesty, and this work did much to rehabilitate his reputation. Secondly, Newman had been surprisingly silent in the face of the definition of papal infallibility at the First Vatican Council. He was cautious about the claims of those who fiercely defended the doctrine of papal infallibility, which had been defined at the First Vatican Council, and had kept his own counsel. Privately, he had some anxiety about the wisdom of its definition. But as Bud Marr points out, Newman saw a strategic opportunity to enter the public debate surrounding papal infallibility, for by responding to Gladstone's charges, he could not only address popular concerns regarding the trustworthiness of Catholics as political subjects, but also offer a critique of the ultramontane position without attacking its adherents directly. From the very beginning of Newman's response to Gladstone, it's clear that he sees the matter principally in terms of conscience. He writes this: "The main question which Mr. Gladstone has started I consider to be this: can Catholics be trustworthy subjects of the state? Has not a foreign power a hold over their consciences such that it may at any time be used to the serious perplexity and injury of the civil government under which they live?" Newman asserts that Gladstone's bill was problematic because the Irish bishops had sought to establish as early as 1847 a distinctively Catholic institution. Indeed, Newman himself had served briefly as rector of that institution in Dublin, producing a series of lectures which eventually were published under the title The Idea of a University. The Irish bishops didn't want their young people attending lectures given by Protestants, and so they refused Gladstone's offer. Who could blame them? The purpose of Newman's argument was to attribute a consistent position to the Irish bishops from 1847 onwards. It had nothing to do with the Vatican decree about papal infallibility in 1871. They wanted their own university, and they wanted the public purse to pay for it. This, Gladstone was unwilling to allow. While Newman sought to defend the integrity of the Irish bishops, he also recognized that the definition of papal infallibility had caused some misunderstanding among the British public about the role of the papacy and the moral and mental freedom of the Catholic convert. It is in this context that Newman writes about conscience. He notes that there are extreme cases in which conscience may come into collision with the word of a pope, but insists that conscience is to be followed in spite of that word. Referencing St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, as well as the Fourth Lateran Council, Newman argues that God is of a certain character, which expressed in human language we call ethical. He has the attributes of justice, truth, wisdom, sanctity, benevolence, and mercy, as eternal characteristics in his nature, the very law of his being, identical with himself. And next, when he became creator, he implanted this law, which is himself, in the intelligence of all his rational creatures. The divine law, then, is the rule of ethical truth, the standard of right and wrong, a sovereign, irreversible, absolute authority in the presence of men and angels. To speak of conscience is to speak of the voice of God in the nature and heart of man, as distinct from the voice of revelation. Newman noted that this was common to all Christian denominations. This is a constituent element of the mind as well as an internal witness of both the existence and the law of God. Conscience, he writes, is the aboriginal vicar of Christ. It is an innate quality possessed by every single human being. conscience is central to Newman's understanding of ethics. And yet, rather inconveniently, Pope Pius IX had published an encyclical, Quanta Cura, in 1864, condemning liberty of conscience, as had Pope Gregory XVI before him. Now, Newman argues that both popes are condemning the popular misconception of conscience and draws a distinction between the Catholic sense of the word conscience and a counterfeit, the right of self-will. This is what the popes had condemned. Nevertheless, the chapter on conscience is made famous by one parting shot at the very end, when Newman says, "Certainly, if I'm obliged to bring religion into after-dinner toasts, I shall drink to the Pope, if you please, still to conscience first, and to the Pope afterwards." That was Newman's riposte to Gladstone's provocation. One of the remarkable things about Newman's writings on conscience is that they remained surprisingly consistent before and after his journey to Rome. Reading his university sermons preached at St. Mary's, you will see a similar accent on the importance of conscience. In a university sermon delivered in 1830, Newman writes that it is obvious that conscience is the essential principle and sanction of religion in the mind. Conscience implies a relation between the soul and a something exterior, and that, moreover, superior to itself, a relation to an excellence which it does not possess, and to a tribunal over which it has no power. He returns to this theme in another university sermon, where he attributes the capacity of conscience through an implicit act of reasoning to detect moral truth wherever it lies hid. The testimony of conscience is a theme which he also visits in his parochial and plain sermons. Of course, Professor Jane Garnett in Oxford has written eloquently about the enormous debt owed by Newman to the 18th century Anglican divine Bishop Butler in his writings on conscience. Butler himself stood in a long line of Anglican theologians who drew on a rich vein of Christian reflection on conscience. Following the English Reformation, particularly when the medieval practice of producing moral manuals for the use of priests in the confessional effectively lapsed, reflection on the workings of conscience became particularly prominent in the writings of a number of Anglican divines. They included people like Richard Hooker, Robert Sanderson, Jeremy Taylor, and William Law. In his study of ascetical theology, Martin Thornton argued that while these moralists drew on scholastic categories and described conscience in terms closely akin to those used by St. Thomas Aquinas, their writings had a very different purpose from the legalist medieval casebooks. These were not manuals for confessors. The Caroline works were directed towards the training of the individual conscience by both personal study and spiritual direction. But it is to Butler in the 18th century that we owe a key development in Anglican reflection about the nature of conscience. For Butler, conscience is a reasoning or reflective principle which operates both prospectively and retrospectively. The distinction is important as earlier thinkers tended to put more emphasis on the retrospective function of conscience. In Butler's view, conscience could also guide moral action as well as reflect on past actions. He assumes that all human beings have an innate sense of right and wrong, and that the many ways of describing a sense of right and wrong all point to one and the same capacity. Conscience, moral reason, moral sense, or divine reason as a sentiment of the understanding or as a perception of the heart. This point is elaborated by Butler in his published sermons. Conscience was intrinsic to humanity and had a supreme authority over all the other principles and passions. More importantly, it was divinely instituted. In his 6th sermon preached at the Rolls Chapel, he alludes to conscience as the voice of God within us. In his 10th sermon, he describes it as that candle of the Lord within, which is to direct our steps. Note the prospective accent of those words. Newman acknowledges his debt to Butler in the Grammar of Assent, where we find similar observations. Newman speaks of conscience as a voice, and moreover, a voice or the echo of a voice, imperative and constraining, like no other dictate in the whole of our experience. Professor Garnett points out that the works of Bishop Butler were specifically prescribed for study in Oxford when Newman was an undergraduate. Newman refers to reading Butler in his diaries. We know that he borrowed a copy of Butler's sermons from Oriel Library in 1827 and 1829. Indeed, in correspondence much later in his life, Newman suggests that his theological works would only be of limited interest. "I very much doubt whether my volumes are fit for any but Englishmen," he wrote. "Without, of course, comparing myself with Bishop Butler, I may say that I am of his school, and see what little account he is, how little known on the continent." We should perhaps not underestimate the significance of this influence for the purposes of the argument set out at the beginning of this lecture. William Gladstone had himself edited a multi-volume edition of Bishop Butler's works. It's difficult to think of a British Prime Minister doing that today. But while Newman has been described as the doctor of conscience in relation to debates about whether he might be declared a doctor of the Church, thus describing his distinctive contribution to Roman Catholic theology, it is intriguing to note his debt to an Anglican divine. I hinted a moment ago that for all Butler's emphasis on this innate moral sense of divine origin, there is also a curious tension in Newman's thought. Like Butler, Newman wants to acknowledge and affirm that conscience is innate, but it is also something that is formed. On one level, this is unremarkable. We find similar observations in the writings of Thomas Aquinas, in which he perhaps elucidates in distinguishing between synderesis as the ground of practical reason, naturally instilled in us, which pushes us towards the good and murmurs against evil, and conscientia, or conscience, which is its practical outworking. This distinction enables Thomas to explore whether an erroneous conscience binds us. As Professor Mark Jordan notes, his reply startles some people because he holds that if something appears to you as bad, even when it is good, then to choose it is to choose the bad, which violates the fundamental principle of reasoned action. In other words, to choose against your conscience violates your reason, and so nullifies the only ground for reasoned action. Professor Jordan remarks that Newman makes a similar argument in his letter to the Duke of Norfolk, but he also notes that in considering this question, Aquinas goes on to ask whether an erroneous conscience excuses bad choices. In response, Aquinas introduces the topic of moral formation. Newman may not address this issue directly in the letter to the Duke of Norfolk, but he does address the question of moral formation at some length in his lectures on the idea of a university. Described as one of the most quoted but least read books in English literature, Newman's writings on higher education have proved influential in all sorts of ways. The purpose of a university was to ensure that those educated there had a cultivated intellect, a delicate taste, a candid, equitable, dispassionate mind. But for our purposes, we should note that it is in this context that he speaks of the reproaches of conscience, of the imperative and obligatory force of conscience implanted in the breast by nature. And yet at the same time, he laments the way in which conscience is also misunderstood. For some, it is not the word of a lawgiver as it ought to be, but the dictate of their own minds and nothing more. He argues against the 18th century philosopher Lord Shaftesbury. For Newman, Shaftesbury's treatment of conscience is, if not an intellectual counterfeit, pretty superficial. Newman contrasts this counterfeit conscience with that formed by Christian virtue. He writes, St. Paul, as I have said, gives us a pattern of evangelical perfection. He draws the Christian character in its most graceful form and its most beautiful hues. He discourses of that charity which is patient and meek, humble and single-minded. He tells us to prefer each the other before himself, to give way to each other, to abstain from rude words and evil speech, to avoid self-conceit, to be calm and grave, to be cheerful and happy, to observe peace with all, truth and justice, courtesy and gentleness, all that is modest, amiable, virtuous, and of good repute. While the world is content with setting right the surface of things, the Church aims at regenerating the very depths of the heart. This is why our conscience, our moral consciousness, needs to be formed, even though the authority of conscience is sacrosanct. Now, if conscience featured in a public spat between Gladstone and Newman towards the end of the 19th century, the events of the 20th century have done nothing to diminish the significance of conscience. The Jesuit moral theologian Jim Keenan argues that conscience became much more prominent in the thinking of moral theologians in the light of the Second World War. European theologians, appalled by the widespread participation of Catholics in unimaginably heinous conduct during the war, developed a robust promotion of the call of conscience for all Catholics. The intervention of prominent German moral theologians who believed that Catholicism had created a curious passivity in the laity which had left them unprepared for the rise of fascism, led to the celebrated paragraph 16 of Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution